The registration desk at the Galactic Academic Consortium processed 642 students on the first day of the new semester. Most of them arrived in groups, surrounded by their own kind, already comfortable. The 643rd arrived alone. He came through the east docking corridor with a single bag over one shoulder and a crumpled paper form in his hand. An actual paper form, printed on actual paper, which the desk attendant, a four-armed Salvari named Brel, had never seen anyone produce before. Brel stared at the paper. The human placed it on the desk and smoothed it flat with 2 fingers. Darian Cole, the human said. Earth. Transfer student. Brel processed the form. It took a moment because the system had to locate the newly created Earth Exchange category, which had only been added to the consortium database 11 weeks ago. Humanity had been admitted to the galactic community less than 2 years back. The academic exchange program between Earth and the consortium was the first of its kind. As far as Brel knew, Darian Cole was the first human to ever stand at this desk. Darian Cole looked around the arrival hall while he waited. He looked at the ceiling, which was 200 feet above them, open to a skylight showing the star field outside. He looked at a group of Quillari students moving past in a shimmer of crystalline light. He looked at a Dranik, 7 feet tall, built like something that had decided gravity was optional, and gave it a small nod. The Dranik blinked. It did not nod back. Brel handed over the registration card. Darian took it, said thank you, and asked where the food dispensary was. His cohort met him that afternoon in study room 14, which was a standard mixed-species room with adjustable gravity plating, atmosphere controls, and seating that could reconfigure for most body types. Darian sat in a regular chair. He put his bag on the floor and took out a notebook, also paper, and a pen. Reth was the first to speak. She was Thervani, which meant she walked on 4 legs, had large amber eyes set wide on a broad face, and possessed a passive bioempathic sense that she could open or close like a window. She introduced herself and said she had studied 2 other species during her time at the consortium, Quillari and Dranik, but had never met a human before. Darian said that was fair. He had never met a Thervani before either. Sona was Quillari. Her body had a faint inner light to it. Her nervous system ran on crystalline bioelectric charge rather than chemical signals, which gave her near-perfect recall and an impressive ability to process multiple data streams simultaneously. She introduced herself by stating her full academic record, her primary field of study, and her expected graduation date. She then said she had read the 3 most widely published papers on human biology and considered herself adequately briefed. Darian said that was great and asked if any of the papers mentioned what humans like to eat. Orvik was Dranik. He was the one Darian had nodded at in the arrival hall, and he had thought about that nod for several hours afterward without being able to explain why. Dranik did not nod. Nodding was not a gesture in their culture, and yet something about the easy, unbothered confidence of it had lodged in his memory like a splinter. He introduced himself with his full clan designation, his weight class, and his homeworld gravity rating, as was customary. Darian wrote all of this down in his paper notebook. He wrote it carefully. He asked Orvik to spell the clan name. Orvik spelled it, slowly. Then he watched Darian write it down by hand with a small stick filled with ink. Your species still uses those? Orvik asked. Some of us, Darian said. I think better when I write things down. Orvik had no response to this. He filed it away. Professor Valos arrived to introduce himself and outline the semester. He was old, even by Salvari standards, gray across all 4 of his upper limbs, with eyes that had seen 40 years of students pass through rooms like this one. He looked at Darian the way a scientist looks at a new variable, not unkindly, but with the careful attention of someone who knew that new variables often complicated the equation. He said the cohort would be together for the full year. He said he expected rigorous work, honest reporting, and intellectual honesty from all of them. He looked at each student in turn as he said this. When he got to Darian, he paused for just a fraction of a second longer than the others. Darian looked back at him without expression. After Valos left, Reth opened her empathic sense briefly, just a small opening, a habit she had when she was curious. She brushed the edge of Darian's emotional field. What she found made her close it again quickly, not because it was dangerous, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was quiet in a way she had not expected. Most species, when they arrived somewhere new and unfamiliar, produced a low constant hum of anxiety or excitement or social positioning. The emotional field was busy. It was full of activity. Darian's was still, not empty. Something was there. But it was like standing at the edge of a very deep lake at night and realizing, slowly, that the water went much further down than you had assumed. She looked at him. He was drawing a small map of the station in his paper notebook, labeling the food dispensary he had found earlier with a small star. She said nothing, but she kept watching him. 3 weeks into the semester, the cohort was assigned a Xenobiology unit. It was a standard course. All mixed species cohorts completed it in the first rotation. The point was to understand the biological limitations of the species you would be living and working alongside. According to Professor Valos, the number one cause of accidental harm between species at the consortium was not hostility. It was ignorance. The assigned reading came to Sona first, because she processed text faster than the others and would inevitably have it memorized before anyone else sat down. She skimmed it in 6 minutes on her way to the study room. By the time she arrived, she had already cataloged the section headings, cross-referenced 3 of the citations against her existing memory, and identified one methodological inconsistency in Chapter 4 that she intended to raise with Valos. The paper was titled, Biological Vulnerability in Class M Carbon Species, a Comparative Study. It was 4 years old, published by a Salvari research team out of the Thesson Institute. It covered 8 species. Chapter 7 was about humans. Sona began reading it aloud when the cohort sat down. She did this because reading aloud helped Reth, who processed auditory information more easily than visual text, and because Orvik had not yet finished his reading from the previous unit, and she had no patience for falling behind. She read Chapter 7 in a clear, even voice. The chapter stated that humans possessed one of the most unusual pain processing systems in documented sentient biology. Unlike the Quillari crystalline interrupt, which triggered an automatic shutdown reflex above a certain pain threshold, or the Dranic neural damping layer, which absorbed and distributed pain signals across the wider nervous system, humans had neither. Their bodies delivered pain signals at full intensity, without biological buffer, without automatic interrupt, without chemical numbing cascade. The research team had described this as a significant evolutionary disadvantage. One researcher had added a personal note at the bottom of the section, flagged in smaller text, which read, "It is unclear how this species has survived long enough to develop spaceflight." Orvik made a short sound that might have been a laugh. Reth said nothing. Darian was sitting across the table with his paper notebook open. He was listening. He had a small expression on his face that was hard to read. Not quite amusement, not quite anything else. He let Sona finish the chapter. He did not interrupt. When she reached the end and looked up, he nodded once and said the methodology in Chapter 4 had a problem. Sona stared at him. The sample group was 11 individuals, Darian said, from the same region of Earth. We are not a uniform species. 11 people from one place is not a representative sample. Sona blinked. She had identified the same inconsistency herself. She had not expected him to raise it. The conclusions in Chapter 7 may also be incomplete, he added, and then he wrote something in his notebook and did not say anything further. Reth watched him. She was keeping her empathic sense closed, because she had made a decision after the first week to be more careful about opening it near Darian without preparing herself first. But she watched his face while Sona read Chapter 7 aloud. She watched him hear a published scientific paper describe his entire species as biologically disadvantaged, buffered by no natural protection, and borderline inexplicable as a survival case. She watched for the reaction. There was no visible reaction. Not suppression. She had seen suppression before, and it had a specific look to it. A tightening around the eyes. A deliberate stillness that was working too hard. This was different. His face was simply quiet, like the reaction had somewhere else to be. Orvik asked him, after a pause, whether it bothered him. Darian looked up from his notebook. He seemed to think about the question genuinely. Not the way someone thinks about a question when they are deciding how much to reveal, the way someone thinks about it when they are actually not sure of the answer yet. It is accurate, Darian said finally. We do feel everything. No buffer. He paused. Whether it bothers me depends on what you mean by bother. Orvik did not know what he meant by bother. He had used it as a simple word. He had not intended it to have layers. I mean, Orvik said carefully, Does it make you feel bad that the paper describes your species this way? Darien thought about it again. No, he said. Accurate information is useful. I would rather people know what they are working with. He said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Like the paper had been describing someone else's problem, not a fundamental feature of his own nervous system. Sona filed the sentence into memory, flagged it, and returned to her notes. Reth opened her empathic sense, just a small crack. Barely anything, just the edge, and caught the faintest signal from Darien's direction. She closed it again immediately. What she had felt, in that fraction of a second, was not distress, not pride, not performance. It was something more like depth. Like whatever Darien Cole felt about any of this lived so far below the surface that the surface itself had stopped showing ripples entirely. She pulled her notebook toward her and wrote one word in Thervani at the top of a blank page. She underlined it 3 times. She did not show it to anyone. The advanced materials and stress testing lab smelled like ozone and recycled air. It was a big room. High ceilings, wide benches, equipment bolted to the floor with the kind of permanence that suggested it had been dropped once, and the story was not pleasant. The cohort came in on a Tuesday, which was the lab's standard scheduling slot for practical units, in the second rotation. Professor Valos walked them through the session objective. They would be running structural tolerance tests on 3 sample materials: a Quillari biocomposite, a Dranic alloy plate, and a standard Earth-manufactured polymer block that Darien had apparently arranged to have shipped up specifically for the comparative unit. Valos had approved the addition with the kind of look that said he was curious enough to not say no. The tests were straightforward. Pressure application, heat exposure, chemical resistance. Standard stuff. The cohort split into pairs, Sona and Orvik on the alloy rig, Darien and Reth on the polymer and biocomposite bench. Valos moved between both stations, watching, noting. Darien worked carefully. He checked each coupling before he ran a test. He had a habit of doing this, touching connection points with 2 fingers, testing the seal, verifying the pressure gauge before he activated anything. Reth noticed it the first time he did it in week 1 and had chalked it up to human caution. Now, 6 weeks in, she recognized it differently. It was not caution. It was just his method. Systematic. Unremarkable to him. The failure happened at the 3rd test rig, on the Dranic alloy station, 40 minutes into the session. The containment coupling was a polymer sleeve unit, standard issue, rated for the pressure levels in the session protocol. What none of them knew, and what the maintenance log would later confirm, was that the sleeve had a microfracture running along its inner seam, likely caused by overcycling in the previous week's session when the lab assistant had pushed the rig past recommended limits to finish before end of shift. The coupling failed under pressure. A feedback arc of superheated plasma vented sideways along the rig's lateral guide rail. The safety shutoffs activated, loud, immediate, correct. But the arc had already traveled. It crossed 2 feet of open air and caught Darien across the left forearm. The sound it made was brief. A hiss, and then nothing. The safety alarm continued its cycle. The lights shifted to amber. Valos shouted something. Orvik stepped back from the rig, his massive frame moving with a speed that his size should not have allowed. Sona's nervous system triggered its interrupt response, a full-body crystalline pulse, involuntary, that locked her joints for 3 seconds while her system reset. Darien stood still. He stood still for 2 full seconds. Not moving, not making a sound. Then he looked down at his left forearm. The burn was visible from across the room. The outer layer of skin was gone along a stripe 4 inches long. The tissue underneath was already reacting, red, raw, wrong in the way that burns are wrong. By the standards of the Xenobiology paper they had read 3 weeks ago, his nervous system was delivering that information at full, unfiltered intensity, with nothing in between the injury and his brain's receipt of it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached to the bench with his right hand, picked up his data pad, and began to type. Valos watched him. Orvik watched him. Reth, who had instinctively flung her empathic sense wide open the moment the arc fired, because her body did that under shock, opened up before her mind could stop it, was standing completely still at her bench with her eyes fixed on nothing. Because what she was receiving from Darien Cole was not nothing. It was not silence. It was not absence. It was pain. Real, complete, enormous pain, the kind that her sense had only ever received from serious injuries, from patients in the medical bay after accidents. It was the full signal, unfiltered, exactly as the paper had described. His nervous system was telling the truth about what had happened to his arm. Layered over it, pressed flat against it, like a hand placed against a door that wanted to open, was something else. Something Reth had spent 6 weeks trying to identify and had not found a word for in any language she spoke. It was not suppression. Suppression fought the signal. This was not fighting. It was something that had decided, quietly and without drama, that the signal was not in charge. Darian finished typing. He looked up. The coupling failure appears to originate from a microfracture in the polymer sleeve, he said. His voice was completely level. Probably stress fatigue from overcycling in the previous session. I have logged it with timestamp and initial cause notation. The lab's supervisor should be informed before this rig is used again. Nobody spoke. The medical alert was still pinging. Valos moved first. He crossed the room in 4 strides and looked at Darian's arm. His expression, for the first time in Reth's memory of him, was not the expression of a scientist observing something. It was something older and simpler than that. Medical bay, Valos said. Yes, Darian agreed. After someone confirms the rig is locked out. He waited. Valos locked out the rig. Then Darian walked to the door. He walked at a normal pace. He did not hold his arm. He did not look at it again. Reth closed her empathic sense slowly, like someone closing a window in the dark. She stood where she was for a moment after he left the room. Orvik said nothing. Sona, whose crystalline memory had captured every second of the last 4 minutes in perfect detail, stood very quietly at her bench and stared at the space where Darian had been standing. None of them said anything for a long time. The consortium medical bay was designed to handle 47 documented species. It had atmosphere pods, gravity adjustments, 17 different types of diagnostic equipment, and a medical staff trained to treat everything from Quillari crystalline fractures to Dranic bone displacement. The attending medic on duty that afternoon was a senior Salvari named Doss, who had worked the bay for 19 years and believed she had seen most things. Darian sat on the treatment bench and held out his arm. Doss scanned it. The burn was significant, a stripe of full-depth dermal loss 4 inches long, the tissue beneath it already inflaming. She had treated worse, but not without a patient reacting. Every species she had worked with produced some form of physical response to this level of injury. Vocalization, trembling, involuntary muscle tension. The Dranic simply went rigid and silent, which was its own kind of signal. The Quillari interrupted, which she had to work around. Even the species with the highest pain tolerance gave her something to read. Darian gave her nothing. She cleaned the wound. He watched. She applied the tissue regeneration compound, which worked on human biology. She had checked, twice, before touching him, and he answered her questions while she worked. His voice was even throughout. He told her his medical history, his allergy profile, and his blood type without being asked because, he said, he figured she would need it. He was correct. She had been about to ask. When she finished and wrapped the forearm in a sterile seal, she held onto his wrist for a moment longer than necessary. She looked at him directly and asked whether he needed anything for the pain. Darian said yes, and told her what he needed. He specified a dosage. He was correct about the dosage. She gave it to him. He thanked her and left. Doss stood in the middle of the medical bay for a moment after he was gone. Then she opened his file and added a notation that had nothing to do with the treatment protocol. She did not know exactly what to write. She wrote, "Patient demonstrates unusual relationship with pain response. Recommend further documentation if pattern continues." She filed it and went back to work. The cohort reassembled in study room 2 hours later. Nobody had planned to. They had all simply arrived, one after another, without discussing it. Orvik was already there when Reth came in. He was sitting in his chair, which had been reinforced specifically for his weight, with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle of the table. Sona arrived a minute after Reth, sat down, and opened her notes without saying anything. They waited. Darian came in last. His left forearm was wrapped. He sat down, put his notebook on the table, and looked at the 3 of them. Nobody spoke for a moment. Orvik unfolded his arms. He leaned forward. Among Dranic, directness was not rudeness, it was respect. You did not circle around something with people you took seriously. He looked at Darian and asked, plainly and without softness, which of the 2 things was true. Had Darian not felt the burn, Or had he felt it and chosen not to react? Darian did not hesitate. I felt it, he said. Orvik's jaw shifted. All of it? Yes. Orvik was quiet for a moment. Then why did you not react? Darian thought about it. He was doing that thing again, genuinely thinking, not performing thought. His eyes moved slightly to the left, which Reth had noticed was what happened when he was working something out rather than retrieving a ready answer. A reaction does not change the outcome, Darian said. The burn happened. The coupling failed. The log needed to be filed before anyone else used that rig. Those were the things that could still be changed. He paused. Reacting to the part that was already finished did not seem useful. The room was quiet. Sona, whose perfect memory had already replayed the sentence twice, was now running it a third time, looking for the logical error. She was looking for the place where the reasoning broke down, where a gap showed, where the conclusion did not follow from the premise. She could not find it. The logic was complete. Reth said nothing out loud. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on Darian, and she was doing something she had decided 3 weeks ago not to do without preparing first. She opened her empathic sense fully. She had prepared this time. She had pulled her own emotional field in tight, built the internal distance that her training required, set herself up so that what she received would not overlap with what she felt. She had done all of this on the walk from the medical bay to the study room. It was not enough. What she received from Darian Cole was not the burn. The burn was there. She could feel its edge, a bright and honest hurt that was not pretending to be smaller than it was. But it was not the whole of what she found. Underneath it, and around it, and going much deeper than she had expected, was something she had not been trained to categorize. It was old. That was the only word she had for it. Not ancient like a cultural memory or a species instinct. Old like something that had been carried for years, accumulated carefully, layer by layer, held without complaint because putting it down was not an option that had presented itself. She realized, with a feeling that spread through her chest like cold water, that this was not unusual for Darian. The burn was new. The rest of it was not. Humans lived inside this. Not this specific injury, the whole condition. The full signal, always, with no buffer, every day, from the moment they were born until the moment they died. And they had decided, not once, but every single morning, in every generation, across all of recorded human history, to continue anyway. She closed her sense. She did it carefully, like setting something fragile down. Darian was looking at her. He had noticed she had gone quiet in a different way than the others. You all right? He asked. Reth looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. I am fine. She picked up her pen. She did not write anything. She just held it and looked at the table and thought about a species that had decided, without any biological help, that the pain was not the one in charge. The outer ring of the consortium station had an observation deck that most students did not bother with. It was far from the residential blocks, a long walk through 3 connector corridors, and the gravity plating out there ran slightly uneven because the maintenance schedule for that section had slipped 2 years ago and never fully recovered. It was quiet because of all of this. It was also one of the few places on the station where the star field was visible through a full-width viewport, not a porthole, not a monitor feed, but actual transparent hull material, floor to ceiling, showing the real thing. Darian had found it in his first week. He came there 2 or 3 evenings per rotation when the rest of the station was loud, and he needed to think. Reth found him there 5 days after the lab. She had spent those 5 days thinking about what she felt when she opened her sense in the study room. She had thought about it carefully, because she was Thervani, and Thervani did not do things with emotional information carelessly. An empath who acted impulsively on received feelings caused harm. She had been trained to sit with what she received, examine it, separate it from her own responses, and only then decide what to do with it. What she had received from Darian Cole had taken 5 days to sit with. She found him at the viewport, standing with his good arm resting against the hull and his wrapped forearm at his side. He was looking at the stars. He turned when he heard her approach and gave her a small nod, that easy, unbothered nod she had first seen him give to Orvik in the arrival hall, which had confused Orvik for hours. She sat on the low bench along the inner wall. He turned back to the viewport. For a while they stayed like that. Neither of them said anything. This was not uncomfortable. Reth had noticed early in the semester that Darian was one of the few people she had met who did not feel the need to fill silence with sound. She asked him, eventually, quietly, what it was like to be human. He turned and looked at her. He was not offended. He had the look of someone who was deciding how honest to be, not whether to be honest, but how far down to go. He sat down on the other end of the bench. It depends on the day, he said. That was where he started. Then, slowly, he kept going. He told her about Earth. Not the version from the Academy databases, the real version, the one he carried with him. He told her about a planet where the sun was yellow and the sky was blue, where the seasons changed and the weather was unpredictable and the oceans were salt, and where the species that had eventually built ships and reached the stars had spent most of its history surviving things that should have ended it. Disease, cold, each other. The full, unfiltered experience of being alive in a world that was not always kind. He told her that humans had no biological buffer. He said this plainly, like he was confirming a fact rather than confessing a vulnerability. He said they had known this about themselves for a long time. The pain of a burn, the weight of a loss, the slow grind of difficulty that went on longer than it should. Humans received all of it directly, without cushion, without the body stepping in to help. He said they got up the next morning anyway. Not because they were numb to it. He was clear about that. Not because it did not reach them. It always reached them. He said it reached them completely, every time, and they got up anyway. They made a decision, not once, not in some great moment of heroism, but every single ordinary morning, across every generation, across every part of the planet, to continue. He told her the word his grandmother had used. An old word, from a language he only half remembered, a language that had been spoken for thousands of years in a part of the world where difficulty was not unusual. The word did not translate directly into Galactic standard. The closest he could get was the decision to continue. But that was not quite right either, he said. It was more active than a decision. It was more like a practice. Something you did every day, deliberately, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. He stopped. He looked at the star field. Reth had not moved. She had kept her empathic sense closed for the entire conversation because she did not need it. His words were enough. What he was describing was not an abstraction. It was not philosophy. It was just what his species did. What they had always done. She thought about the study room. About the chapter Sona had read aloud. About the researcher's footnote that had asked, with genuine puzzlement, how humans had survived long enough to develop spaceflight. She thought she understood the answer now. I have a concept, she said quietly. In Thervani empathy training. The core signature. Every species has one. The emotional pattern that sits underneath everything else. The thing that is always present no matter what else is happening. She paused. I have been trying to identify the human one since you arrived. Darian looked at her. I found it in the study room, she said. After the lab. He waited. She did not say it out loud. There was no word for it in any language she spoke that was large enough. And she thought, looking at him, that he probably already knew. Not consciously. Not as a concept he thought about. But in the way that you know the color of your own walls. So constant, so present, that you stopped seeing it as something separate from the room. She just looked at him. After a moment he nodded. Once. The same nod he had given Orvuk on the first day. Then he turned back to the stars, and they sat together in the quiet for a long time, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Professor Valos had a habit, after 40 years of teaching, of writing his end-of-term field notes on paper. Not because he was sentimental about it. Because he had found, long ago, that the act of writing slowly made him more honest. You could not outrun your own hand. The words appeared at the same speed as the thought, and if the thought was incomplete, the sentence showed it. He sat at his desk on the last evening of the academic term and opened a fresh page. He had written end-of-term notes on hundreds of students. Most took him 20 minutes. He wrote the name, the observed behaviors, the academic performance, the integration notes, the recommendation. Done. Filed. Next. He wrote Darian Cole's name at the top of the page and sat for a moment. Then he wrote for 2 hours. He wrote about the lab incident in precise detail. He wrote about the maintenance log entry, filed before the medical alert had finished its first cycle. He wrote about the conversation in study room 14. He had not been present for it, but he had read Reth's session notes, which she had submitted as part of her xenocultural observation unit, and they were thorough. He wrote about what the attending medic DOS had added to the patient file. He wrote about what he himself had observed across the full semester. The paper notebook, the systematic pre-checks on lab equipment, the way Darien asked questions that were simple in form and not simple in content, the way he received information about his own species without defensiveness and without performance. He wrote about the chapter in the Xenobiology paper. He had assigned it before Darien arrived in his cohort. He had read it himself at the time and found it adequate. He read it again after the lab incident and found it deeply incomplete. Not wrong. Exactly, the biological facts were correct. But it had treated those facts as the whole of the story, as though the absence of a buffer was simply a disadvantage, a deficiency, a thing the species lacked. It had not asked what the species had built in its place. Valos wrote that sentence twice. When he was finished, he read the report back. It was 3 times the length of anything he had written in his career. He made 2 small corrections, closed the notebook, and transferred the content to the digital filing system. He submitted it to the Consortium Review Board under the standard end-of-term protocol. Then he opened a separate channel and forwarded the same report, with a single line of annotation, to the Galactic Academic Council's Standing Committee on Species Classification and Threat Assessment. The annotation read, "Recommend immediate revision of the human species vulnerability profile. Current classification is inaccurate and potentially dangerous to any party that relies on it." He sent it. He closed the channel. He went to make tea. The review board read the report on a Wednesday morning. 3 members requested access to the lab incident recording before they had finished the first section. They watched a human being burned across the forearm, a real burn, visible on the enhanced footage, the tissue damage clear, stand still for 2 seconds, and then file an accurate maintenance report in a calm voice before the medical alert completed its first cycle. They watched it twice. The committee chair, a senior Quillari named Voss whose species had involuntarily interrupted in the lab footage just behind the human, asked her assistant to pull the Xenobiology paper. She read Chapter 7. She read it against Valos's field notes. She read it against the medic's file notation. She read it against Reth's observation report, which described what a trained bioempath had received from Darien Cole in the moment after the injury. Pain, full and unfiltered and real, and layered over it something with no existing galactic classification. Voss sat back in her chair. She told her assistant to begin drafting a revised species profile. She said to allocate full research resources. She said she wanted it done properly. The semester-end gathering was held in the consortium's main hall, which was large enough to hold every student and faculty member at once, which was the point. It was not a ceremony. No speeches, no rankings, no awards. Just a closing gathering, a formal end to the academic year, a chance for cohorts to disband in a way that felt intentional rather than simply trailing off. Darien stood with his cohort near the east wall. Sona told him, with great seriousness, that she intended to pursue formal research into human psychological architecture. She said she had already drafted a preliminary proposal. She said she expected it to take several years, and that the methodology would need to be entirely original because the existing literature was inadequate. Darien told her good luck and said she should budget extra time. She said she had already accounted for complexity variables. He said that was not what he meant. She looked at him. Then, slowly, she understood. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but the crystalline equivalent of one, a faint brightening of the light beneath her skin. She wrote something in her notes. Orvik came to stand beside Darien without announcement. He did not introduce this moment. He did not frame it. He simply moved to stand next to him, and after a short pause, he placed one large hand briefly on Darien's shoulder. Among Dranik, this gesture had a specific meaning. It was not given often. It was not given lightly. It was not given based on rank or strength or performance in competition. It was given when someone had shown you something about themselves that required no further explanation, something that had changed, quietly and permanently, the category you had placed them in. Orvik held it for 2 seconds. Then he removed his hand and looked at the other side of the room. Darien said nothing. He understood, in the way that you understand something without being told, what the gesture meant. He looked at the hall around him. Hundreds of species, dozens of worlds, an entire community of people who had built something here, together, in the middle of the dark between stars. Reth walked beside him as they moved toward the corridor. She did not open her empathic sense. She did not need to. She knew what she would find. Outside the hall, The station's outer viewports showed the star field, the same one visible from the observation deck, the same one Darian had been watching the night she found him and asked him what it was like to be human. She thought about the word he had told her, the one that did not translate, the one that meant something close to, the decision to continue, the thing his grandmother had called it, the thing his species had been practicing every morning across every generation for as long as there had been humans to practice it. The stars outside were very old. They had been burning for a long time. She thought that the humans probably understood that better than anyone else in the room. She did not say this out loud. She just walked beside him, and the corridor was quiet, and somewhere behind them the hall was still full of sound.